Hello and welcome to episode 104 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Babones, and joining me today is Matt Taylor, Director of the Intergenerational Program at the Center for Independent Studies. I'll be talking to Matt about what else? Intergenerational equity and his plans for the program at CIS. Matt Taylor, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, great. Thanks for asking. Look, let's get right into it. You're leading a new program at CIS. It's just starting up. Can you tell us a little bit about your own background and then what your plans are for the program?
Sure. Well, it's a new program of research on sort of intergenerational public policy, the intergenerational aspects of public policy. It's a great opportunity. It's something I'm very excited about. It's something that's kind of, I suppose, closer to my heart, having just 18 months ago become a father for the first time.
So, congratulations!
Thanks. The implications for the policies we make today for future generations is something that's very important to me at this point in my life, as it is, I think, to many parents. So I've just come on board just a little bit over a month ago. And prior to that, I was had a research position at the Australian National University. So I spent sort of part of my career at the Australian National University, part of it at the University of Canberra. Prior to that, I was a federal government bureaucrat. And this is my second stint at CIS. I was at CIS sort of over the course of 2014 and 2015, working on various aspects of social policy. So, I mean, intergenerational public policy it's sort of interesting because it's not like its own well-defined discipline. It's not like, labor economics or education or something like that, right. But it sort of cuts across all of these areas. So while I don't necessarily count myself at this point in time an expert on intergenerational public policy, I've spent my career looking at a range of issues that do have that really important intergenerational aspect, like retirement incomes and education and stuff like that. So I think I've got the skills and I'm ready to jump into it.
Well, welcome to CIS, and perhaps I should say welcome back to CIS. Now, we know about your now legendary fathering skills, but what other skills? So just kidding you there. But what other skills?
I'm getting there, I think.
I understand you're coming from economics. I mean, what area of economics you specialize in, and what sort of background do you have in economics and public policy?
So I suppose I probably used to describe myself as a labor economist, but I think most of what I've sort of spent my career doing one way or the other is analysis of household survey data and the modeling of tax and transfer policies.
Okay.
So
a serious empirical economist who's going to bring some numbers to the program.
Oh, that's very kind.
Well, there are all sorts of economists out there, and we like to see really, data-driven quantitative research here at CIS. So what sort of areas are you going to be commissioning research in? What are the priorities for the intergenerational program?
I think the program is going to be organized around 4 primary themes. Some of it will be intergenerational inequality.
Right.
So this is like comparing different generations or cohorts of Australians that were born at different periods of time, but looking at them at the same age.
Okay.
Because, finding that older Australians at a point in time have more wealth than younger Australians is kind of obvious. Like they've had more of a lifetime to accumulate that wealth. That in itself doesn't mean the wheels have fallen off your society. In fact, you probably want people towards the end of their lives to have enough wealth to sort of get them through retirement.
Right.
It's important to look at people at the same age. But there's one of the things that is getting a lot of media attention at the moment is intergenerational inequality in home ownership.
Okay.
So for the boomer generation and the ones before, you sort of see them entering middle age, sort of leveling off at about 80% home ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily outright home ownership, but getting into the housing market. Whereas if you look at if different generations in that 35 to 39 age group, for the boomers, it was sort of 3/4 of them had gotten to the housing market in that age group, whereas for my generation, it's under 60%. So there's evidence of intergenerational. I think there's a legitimate concern about intergenerational inequality. And
from what I've read in the newspapers, that's all due to overconsumption of avocados. I see endless articles about avocados versus saving for home ownership. But
I think that was courtesy of Bernard Salt. I think he was the first person to write that in an opinion piece. And there are a lot of millennials on Twitter who didn't much like that analysis. But in all seriousness, I think, I mean, in terms of how we got here, I think the main driver of it is a lack of housing supply. I think there are people who want to tighten up on negative gearing and capital gains tax and what have you. But I think that's fiddling around the edges. I think it's mainly a supply story. Whether it's because millennial hipsters are eating too much avocado on toast, I think, if you feel like getting the housing market is something out of reach, then what are you going to do? You're probably going to spend more money on consumption.
Right. Well, you still got to eat breakfast. So the number one research area for you is intergenerational inequality. But you said there were four main research areas that you.
Yeah. So intergenerational inequality is one of them. The philosophy around intergenerational equity is something else I want to look at. But I think that's more likely to be commissioned research rather than stuff I'm going to undertake myself, because that's not really my skill set. But the other thing I want to look at is intergenerational mobility. And there's sort of broadly two ways to look at that. One is absolute and one in relative terms. We might get to that a little bit later. But the final theme will be fiscal burden. So to what extent are the policy settings that we have in place today, are they fiscally sustainable, and to what extent are they going to be financed by future generations? Or to what extent, I guess, there's going to be some sort of transfer from old to young. That's sort of a fairly normal thing. But is that being done in an equitable way? Is it being done in a sustainable way? And I guess because I have a background in modeling these sorts of policies, that's sort of where I'm most at home.
Now, I don't mean to drive things in my own direction, but as a sociologist, not being an economist, of those four topics, the one that probably interests me most is intergenerational mobility. So, I mean, could you give us some just basic vocabulary around, I think you mentioned the terms absolute and relative mobility. I mean, what are the key issues here for intergenerational mobility?
So absolute intergenerational income mobility, which I'll just call absolute mobility, is fundamentally how many children out-earn their parents. And usually you want to compare people at the same age. Most of these studies sort of focus on a late 30s, early 40s, because that's when most people sort of reach the top of their age earnings profile. It's sort of when you're in your prime earnings years, and because it gives you a sense of who's high income and who's low income.
Right.
So, the alternative way, or another way of looking at intergenerational income mobility, is to consider it in relative terms. Okay. So that's more about the strength of the association between a child's income and that of their parents. Okay. So if you live in a society where everyone who was born into a household in the top 1% ends up the top 1% of their generation's income distribution, everyone born at the median ends up, at the median, then you've got no relative intergenerational mobility.
Now, we all want to believe that a rising tide lifts all ships. We've heard so much about the extraordinary economic growth in Australia for the last 30 years. Has that rising tide, in fact, been lifting all ships? Have we had absolute intergenerational mobility in Australia?
So we have about 2/3 of current generations are going to out-earn their parents. That's been true for quite some time, or that estimate appears to have been relatively stable across time, according to the latest research. But
only 2/3.
Yeah,
I mean, that seems very. I mean, just my gut instinct is it seems very low when over a 30-year period we would expect the economy to roughly double in size. I mean, is my rough? I think very roughly, is that the right number?
Sure, but I guess you'd probably need a lot of economic growth for the income distribution. And keep in mind, this is real terms, not nominal terms.
Right.
So adjusting for prices. I think you need probably a lot of economic growth for the child's distribution of income to sort of be completely to the right of the parents. Like there's going to be some overlap. As for, I suppose what you raise is a really good question. What is the normatively correct amount of absolute income mobility? Like is 2/3
I mean, the reason 2/3 sounded shocking to me is even if there was no economic growth, we'd expect 50% of children to out-earn their parents and 50% to under-earn their parents. So the fact that it's only 2/3, I mean, I'm sorry, we didn't, obviously everyone listening, we didn't rehearse this. I'm just surprised. How could it be only 2/3?
Well, I think so my view of this literature and these estimates is like, rather than fixating on particular numbers too much, I think we just like, if we agree that absolute intergenerational income mobility is a good thing, I think we do. I think we can say that's a consensus. I'm yet to meet the parent who doesn't want their child to have a higher standard of living than what they enjoy. Then I think we want to get the policy settings right to maximize the chances that someone can do better than their parents.
Okay.
So, is it too low? Could we be doing better? Absolutely. But if it was 90%, would we then say it's a policy failure? I'm not entirely certain. I think what we need to focus on is the trend. Like if we were going backwards, like if it was 60% for my generation and then it became 40% for my son's generation, then that would suggest we need to take a very long, hard look at our policy settings. But I suppose one thing we do know is the extent of that absolute mobility has been lower for the more recent generations. So it was more like 80% of the boomer generation out-earned their parents. So it has been declining over time. And I think that's more of a concern than is 60%, or is 2/3 a good or a bad number? The fact that that's coming down. And the researchers that wrote this paper for Australia, Peter Saminsky and Tomas Kennedy, they try to get a sense of why that's happened, and they put slowing growth accounts for about 2/3 of that, rather than income inequality within a generation. So I think that tells you something about what policy settings you want. You want pro-growth policy settings. You want a dynamic, competitive economy if you want to maximize the chances of children doing better than their parents.
Something that strikes me that's almost unique about the Australian situation. In Australia, roughly something like 30% of the population is foreign-born, and so presumably, in that case, they're not entering into these intergenerational surveys because their parents, 30% is foreign-born, and an even larger percentage have parents who are foreign-born. So there's this odd situation where a large percentage of the population must not be in these surveys because, well, simply put, their parents weren't in Australia. Yeah. So how does that? I mean, might that be kind of warping these analyses as a very large number of high-income immigrants come in? Is that maybe warping our understanding of intergenerational mobility?
Well, perhaps to put it another way, if you have sort of highly aspirational immigrants who do quite well in their generation, but might have come from families that had very, very low real incomes measured in Australian dollars. I guess it's sort of so we could probably spend an entire podcast just picking apart the methodologies of these papers, but maybe that wouldn't be the most fascinating thing for the listeners. But I suppose just briefly, some of these studies don't have direct observations of the incomes of the parents.
Right.
And that is partly due with some of the data limitations in Australia. So what some of these studies are doing, they're not measuring the income of the parents directly. They're measuring the report, the child's report of what occupation their parent was in, and then inferring that. So the issue you raise, I think, is an important one, but I don't think it's as well. I think it's a little bit nuanced. I suppose we don't know exactly what those fathers might have earned in their own country, I guess, is more the issue.
Right.
But we've got some sense of what they might have earned if they were, here, if the father was actually present in Australia.
Okay. Now, we are a live program, and if you're out there listening live and you'd like to ask a question to Matt, please just feed it through in the YouTube chat, and we will try to get your questions in. In the meantime, Matt, I'd like to ask you maybe about the more challenging question, which is relative mobility. I mean, intergenerational mobility sounds great. The child of a cashier at a grocery store grows up to become a barrister, and this is an incredible success story. But of course, that kind of intergenerational mobility is only possible if someone who's the child of a barrister ends up being a clerk in a grocery store, right? Because we can't have relative mobility up without someone else having relative mobility down. So is relative mobility, well, could you just give us some basics on what's the theory around relative mobility? Is relative mobility necessarily a good thing? How much of it is good? Are people politically ready to accept relative mobility if it's their child that ends up relatively adjusting downward?
All good questions. So I might just start with a preliminary about what this literature attempts to measure. Sure. So as with absolute, it's about comparisons of children and parents, but this is more specifically about the extent to which the parent's income is a good predictor of the child's income. Okay. So there's Australian studies that suggest the relative intergenerational income elasticity in Australia is about 0.2. And what that means...
Explain to us, you have to explain to us what that means, Yeah.
So what that means is a 10% increase in the income of a father is going to be associated with a 2% increase in the income of their son. The reason why these studies tend to focus on fathers and sons is they tend to spend the entire life course in the labour market, whereas if you're looking at women, that's less the case, but it's sort of more of an issue for the older generations of women who may have spent a lot of their career out of the workforce caring for children. So these studies estimate these elasticities, and I guess they're sort of a summary measure of the extent or the association between parental income and child income. So in Australia, the estimates tend to come out about 0.2, and that sort of puts us as a more mobile society relative to the US, but not quite as mobile as some of the Scandinavian countries. The Australian research would suggest that it's been relatively stable since the 1960s, although there are some studies that suggest we've become a little bit more immobile recently. But I suppose to address some of the normative questions, I suppose it is sort of quite a different perspective on mobility, different to absolute mobility, because as you say, if some children are going to move up in their generation, others are going to have to move down. So it's kind of hard to, I guess, to talk about relative mobility separate from a discussion of what merit is. And I think in the public policy space, this becomes quite complicated because, superficially, we all want the most meritorious to rise to the top. No one's going to argue otherwise. But then we've got to agree on what merit is. And if you want, centrally planned policies, a government that's highly interventionist in ensuring that it is the most meritorious that rise to the top. I mean, you need a consensus on what merit is, and then you need some objective measure of it. And it's hard to get three people in a room who are going to agree on that. So I think my view of this is you want the positions of power and prestige in your society to be contestable. You want them to be competitive. I don't lie awake at night thinking about this 0.2 and what it means. I don't think we need to be that prescriptive.
That question merits an interesting one, though. I mean, we have this debate in universities. If we want to admit the most meritorious people for a competitive degree program, would that be those who have, say, the highest score on the entry test? Or would that be those who accomplish the highest score relative to their own high school, right? So that they're especially performing well, given the milieu out of which they're coming. Do you have any view on these sort of social interventionist approaches to merit?
So I'm probably inclined to take the latter view, at least in the context of financing higher education. So my view is the people who should be going to university should be those who are going to benefit from it. Those who are going to complete, they're going to get the higher earnings from doing so. And that generates not just private benefits for them, but also social benefits for the rest of us. So I think that's what you want. So if you have people who might have had, so the prospective university students are going to have experience quite different levels of quality of secondary education. So I guess, supposed to use an analogy, the starting line isn't in the same position for everyone. But what I think matters for public policy is who's going to be able to finish the race. Like, there's no point financing the education of someone who's not going to get through. That's true regardless of whether they came from a private or a public school. But there is a lot of research that suggests if you compare students from private schools and public schools who got the same ATAR score, so they're, in as far as that's a good measure of ability, they've got the same ability. It's often the case that the ones in public schools outperform their private school peers, because for them to have gotten that ATAR, they'd probably have to have been a bit more self-directed in their learning, a little bit more tenacious maybe. So what I think that tells you is that, the ATAR score probably contains some important information about the extent to which you're going to get through your university education, right. But the strength of that signal, or how meaningful a signal it is not going to be the same for all students. So I'm definitely in that latter camp.
Now, you said that one of the topics your program on intergenerational program at CIS would be tackling was the fiscal burden. Now, I've heard economists on both sides of these issues, and I want to be clear, I'm not an economist. That's why I'm turning to you. I've had some say that, so much debt has been run up during the coronavirus crisis that
$670 billion.
That the next generation will be paying for it for however many decades. On the other hand, I hear other economists saying that all economic payments are made out of current income, and so there's no such thing in a way as this built up debt. Instead, it's a distributional issue. It's a matter of who's paying, not a matter of the burden being on these particular people, but rather how society chooses to pay in the current year. And so I've heard these two versions of economics. Can you kind of cut the clutter for us on this and explain what are we talking when we're talking about a fiscal burden on the future? Is it really literally a fiscal burden on these young people to pay for something that happened in the past? Or is it just that society will be apportioning its resources differently in the future?
So I think you're right. Like, what matters here is who's going to pay it off. But there's definitely an age dimension to that. So the beneficiaries of the some of the policies that were made around COVID, a lot of them were older people who are not going to be paying it back because they're not necessarily going to be around for that much longer. So it's going to be younger Australians who are going to be facing higher average tax rates than what they might otherwise would, to ensure that we can service that debt. Like, even if you don't think we need to pay the debt back, we've definitely got to be making those interest payments, or otherwise we default on our debt and we start to look like a basket case economy. And yeah, I mean, there's no way around it. The younger Australians are going to face higher average tax rates, and so will future generations of Australians.
But if the debt is internal, and again, I'm not an economist, so I'm asking you this to explain this because I've read this from other economists. If the debt is internal and it's not foreign debt, then current consumption can't, or current a reduction in current consumption can't possibly pay for something that's already happened in the past. That is, whatever happened in 2021, 2022 was paid for in 2021, 2022. Is it really the case that we're going to give up consumption in 2023, 4, 5 to pay for something? Or is it just that we're going to redistribute income in 2022, 23, 24, 25 from taxpayers to bondholders, but within the same society, which is
sure,
to say...
Yeah, that's where I thought you were going with this. Like, if we lived in a closed economy, then I guess someone owns the debt and someone's going to, the additional tax revenue is going to be paid by someone to hand the interest payments to someone else in Australia who happens to own the debt. No, I don't have this number at my fingertips, but I'm going to go on a limb and say a lot of it is going to be foreign debt. So it is going to be...
Oh, it is. So does Australia have substantial foreign debt?
Sorry?
Does Australia have substantial foreign debt? I'm a newbie here.
Oh, yeah, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how much of it is foreign, but we're a relatively small economy. I would think a large percentage of it will be foreign debt.
And then from this standpoint, and again, forgive the amateur questions, we all are afraid about inflation, and I think none of us want to see high inflation, but in a kind of strange way, is inflation solving the intergenerational equity problem because the bondholders are being hit by inflation, whereas the young people are seeing rising salaries because of inflation?
Well, I don't know that they're seeing rising or abruptly rising salaries just yet, but I think what really matters is what your standard of living is in real terms. And I think that the data on that suggests we're not necessarily moving forward there. But these matters of fiscal policy is like debt is one aspect of it, but it's really what was when we were taking out that debt, what expenditures was it financing and who was benefiting from that, I guess. And the older there's increasing pressures on the budget due to an aging Australia. So at the start of this century, there were upwards of 5 working age Australians for every retiree. When the amount of debt peaks at over half of annual GDP, there's going to be something like 3.3. So look at younger generations today, there's going to be fewer of them per retiree who'll be taxed to fund the age pension, age care, greater health expenditures.
And it doesn't mean to be... Go on, sorry.
Yeah, so I think if you're interested in intergenerational equity, there then sort of arises a question of, is it possible that our policy settings aren't taking into account the fact that some of this age cohort have significant amounts of wealth that they could potentially be drawing on themselves rather than asking young Australians and future generations to face higher average tax rates going forward? I think that's sort of the more important policy debate that needs to be had. And it's one that we at CIS can contribute to.
All right. Well, Matt Taylor, we're out of time. I always do lose track of time because I enjoy these discussions so much. I have a lot more questions to ask you, but I'm not able to get to them. So I do apologize for that. Matt Taylor, thank you very much for joining us today.
It was a pleasure. Great to be with you.
Thanks also to our producer, Nico Malian. The director of the Center for Independent Studies is Tom Switzer. I'm Salvatore Babones. Thank you for watching On Liberty.